Thank you. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming to what I think will be a wonderful event tonight. I'm Janet Ransley. I'm the director of the Griffith Criminology Institute, and it's been my very great privilege to have been a colleague of Ross Hommel's for nearly 20 years, Ross. And I'm particularly delighted that he's been invited to give the Keith Hancock Lecture this year, which will be delivered tonight in Brisbane, and then again on another occasion elsewhere in Australia. My role is to thank you all for coming, to thank you for taking your seats, to welcome you, to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The Griffith Criminology Institute is very proud to be co-hosting this event. We're very proud that Ross has been honoured and asked to deliver the lecture. For those of you who don't know us, we're the largest concentration of criminology researchers in Australia and one of the largest in the world. And a lot of that, and we're not just the biggest, we're also the best, but a lot of that, and I'm not biased, a lot of that is down to the initial work put in by Ross as our inaugural professor, as the inaugural head of school, I think, and a lot of the groundwork that Ross laid some 20 years ago in getting our school off the ground. And we really have a huge debt that we owe Ross for getting our school into such a good position so that we can now make those bold claims that I've made. What's going to happen tonight is in a minute I'm going to introduce Professor Richard Holden, who will be giving us a little bit of background about the Keith Hancock Lecture. And then Richard will introduce Ross, who will be talking for about 30 or 35 minutes about a subject which I know is very, very close to his heart and which he's very passionate about. And keeping him to 35 minutes might be a challenge, but we'll try and do that, because if we do, then there'll be about 15 minutes afterwards for questions and answers. And we will have some microphones going around at that point if you want to have an opportunity to extend the discussion with Ross. If you don't get an opportunity to do that, please do stay for some refreshments after the lecture and continue the discussion at that point. But it's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Holden, Chair of the Public Forums Committee of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, who are the co-hosts of this event tonight. Richard is Professor of Economics at the UNSW Business School and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow from 2013 to 2017. Prior to that, he was on the faculty at the University of Chicago and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, having received his PhD from Harvard in 2006, where he was a Frank Knox Scholar. He's a Fellow of the Econometric Society and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and currently edits the Journal of Law and Economics, is academic co-lead of the UNSW Grand Challenge on Inequality, and is the founding director of the Herbert Smith Freehills Initiative on Law and Economics at UNSW. It's my pleasure to welcome Richard to Brisbane, to Griffith, and to this event tonight to introduce the lecture series. Please join me in thanking Richard.
Thank you very much, Janet, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this wonderful event. As Janet mentioned, I have the good fortune to be chair of the Public Forums Committee for the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, which basically means I get to come to events like this and introduce distinguished scholars, celebrate their research and learn from hearing about it. And I'm looking forward to doing that again tonight with Professor Ross Hommel. The Academy of Social Sciences in Australia is one of the 4 learned academies in Australia, along with the Australian Academy of Humanities, the Australian Academy of Sciences and the Australian Academy of Technology, Sciences and Engineering. Our goal is to promote and celebrate excellence in research, teaching and public engagement across the social sciences. And our academy is comprised of elected fellows across 18 different disciplines with a very wide range and great breadth across the social sciences. Tonight we're here to hear from a wonderful scholar to deliver the Keith Hancock Lecture, one of our most important events for the year. The Keith Hancock Lecture was inaugurated in 2009, and it's named after Emeritus Professor Keith Hancock, AO, who has been a Fellow of the Academy since 1968, if you can believe that, and is a past President of the Academy as well, and it's one of our most important events. Tonight we'll hear from someone who's known to many of you, Professor Ross Homel, whose list of accomplishments is sort of far too long for me to go through and even too long for me to commit to memory. He's Foundation Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University here, of course. He served as Director of the Key Centre for Ethics, Law, Justice and Governance, was the founder and Director of the Griffith Institute for Social and Behavioural Research, has served as Head of School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, as a Commissioner of the Queensland Criminal Justice Commission, among many other accomplishments. He's received tremendous recognition for his great work, including being invested an officer in the General Division of the Order of Australia in the citation read for service to education, particularly in the field of criminology, through research into the causes of crime, early intervention and prevention methods, something that I think he will touch on tonight. He was even, I'm told, in the same year, 2008, recognised by the Premier of Queensland as a Queensland Great, which is really something to be proud of, and was even shortlisted for Australian of the Year in the same year. It's a tremendous time for social science in Australia. There's a lot of discussion about mathematics and STEM and the sciences. My colleague Michelle Simmons was awarded Australian of the Year this year, and that's something that's wonderful and to be celebrated. I think it's also a kind of golden age for the social sciences, where the methods that have been developed, the data that's available and the computing power that's available to analyse it and represent it is at an all-time high. It feels a little bit, as a social scientist, like it must have felt to be a particle physicist at the turn of the 20th century. So it's a very opportune time to celebrate work on some of the most important social issues in Australia. So, Professor Ross Homel is obviously a fine Queenslander, a great Australian and a distinguished scholar, and it's my great privilege to invite him to present the 2018 Keith Hancock Lecture.
Well, Richard, thank you for that very generous and embarrassing introduction. Janet acknowledged our Indigenous residents, owners, occupiers for 50, 60,000 years of this land. I won't repeat the words she used, which I agree every one of them is very important, but I'm particularly wanting to think about the children, our First Nations children, who live in this state and elsewhere throughout Australia, because unfortunately many of them end up in conditions that I regard as unacceptable in 21st century Australia. Now, just before I begin, I'm going to acknowledge a number of people here tonight. First of all and foremost, my wife Beverly, without whom I would not be here tonight, I can absolutely guarantee that. And my extended family, some of whom are here tonight as well. It's wonderful to see you here. And we have a number of flourishing children and grandchildren. And I think about my 4 grandsons when I talk about things like this. Because my question is, why can't the life they're having be available to all children in Australia? And I'll come back to that. I'd like to thank the Academy for asking me to speak, and I am going to mention the role of economics in my remarks tonight, if I ever get started. And Janet, thank you, and to the GCI and to all my colleagues in criminology who, I think with rather bemused tolerance, have created the perfect environment for a research program like mine. And the CREATE project, well, it's not my research project because, in fact, there's a large number of people here from the team this evening. I particularly want to mention Sarah Branch and Kate Freiberg, who really are, well, it's no surprise that behind every prominent man there are extremely brilliant and productive and hard-working women. I've already mentioned my wife. Well, there's a whole research team consisting mostly of women. But I won't go through the whole list, but Sama Lo Choi is our statistical colleague. is particularly important. Tara McGee, my daughter Jackie's now doing some work with us. You've got to keep the family involved if you can. And look, finally, I do want to acknowledge the many friends and colleagues who are here tonight who share, I think, the passion for this topic. I did have apologies from a number of people. Roy Webb and his wife apologised. He was hoping to be here. He was Vice-Chancellor at Griffith for many, many years, and in fact is a lot of the reason why criminology has flourished here. Kathy Daly, my colleague, just up the corridor, had the worst excuse I've ever heard. She said she's been called to a meeting with the Prime Minister tomorrow as part of the research advisory group for the Royal Commission into abuse of children in institutions and so on. So there are a number of people who would have liked to be here. So what do I want to do in this lecture tonight? I want to, first of all, pose an important problem and try and tell something of the story of how I, together with many, many colleagues, have attempted to tackle that problem over the years using the methods of the social and behavioural sciences. You can see, I think I've managed to get all the right logos in there. That's the logo for our current research project, Creating Pathways to Prevention. And RealWell, the RealWell.org website, is the website for the not-for-profit enterprise that we're trying to create. And in a way, I think that's going to emerge as an intermediate organisation, which I talked about in the abstract for this lecture. And I managed to also get the Academy logo in as well as Griffith. So I think that was a major accomplishment, and I can probably sit down now. So I want to pose a problem, but I also want to talk briefly about what we're currently doing to try and put this sort of work on a sustainable basis. So much good work across the whole of the university system in Australia is project-based, and it's very difficult to make the transition to something that's more permanent and sustainable, which we're at the point of needing to do. And finally, by way of preliminary remark, I want to do all of this in as straightforward a way as possible. I want to be clear and interesting. So let's get going, because if I start mystifying things, put your hand up. Or just yell out. Now, I want to start briefly with some reflections from a breakfast meeting that I attended here in Brisbane a few weeks ago. It was up in the Tower of Power, number 1 William Street on the 19th level, so beautiful views of the city and the river. And it was organised by an organisation called Impact Boom. Now, why don't we have a name like that, Paul? And the name of the forum was Activating Systems Change, Cross-Sectoral Ideas to Tackle Complex Community Issues. So naturally I went along. Now, first thing I noticed was that most of the audience were much younger than me and extremely energetic. But I did admire them for being out really early. Secondly, they had a high-powered panel who led the discussion, including our own Professor Brad Jackson, the new Professor of Social Innovation here at Griffith, but a range of other very talented people as well. Belinda Drew from Community Services Alliance, Helen Sharpley from the Queensland Public Service Commission, and Steve Williams, who's a Queensland Social Innovation Manager at Marist 180. So you have these really bright, experienced, dynamic people gathering to talk about how to tackle complex problems in an innovative way. Now, the first issue that flashed up on the screen was, why have things not gotten better in disadvantaged communities despite the meteor showers of investment over many, many decades? So we've thrown a lot of money over the years, in fact probably billions. Richard could tell us if we asked him, probably. And we've not seen the dial shift much at all. Sometimes we talk about closing the gap or not closing the gap. Now, there were a range of explanations and solutions offered. One was that, well, it's a macroeconomic issue. You see, there's a bit of economics. It's all about neoliberalism and inequality. So we're looking to you, Richard, for a solution there. Another person said we need to invest at the systems level, not just fund fragmented services. Sounds pretty good. Brad Jackson's referred to the importance of place-based initiatives for governance, which need to move from representative leadership to generative leadership that's focused on solving problems. So in other words, if you're doing something in a community, you don't just elect or appoint people who are going to represent different interest groups. You need people in charge who are going to be focused on solving the problem and agree on what that problem is. That's easier said than done. And Another person suggested that a social enterprise approach is needed. We need to get in there and mobilise communities for local solutions using innovative strategies, and we need to put local people in charge. So I would agree that there is very great value in all of these ideas, and I'm not going to go into the points I was going to make about those different strategies. But I was left both impressed with the energy and commitment to change that was evident in the gathering, but also I left a little bit despondent, a little bit depressed, because basically what I couldn't see was that there was any method beneath the enthusiasm. Everybody was going to tackle it from this angle or that angle. We were going to get together and we were going to combine our energy, but I don't think simple solutions, and some of those approaches are a little oversimplified, really get to, there's a slide of from the proceedings of that forum. You can see the panel up there, including Brad Jackson there with glasses in the middle. You know he's a professor because he's got glasses. I love this quote from H.L. Mencken, the American journalist. For every complex problem, there is a simple solution, and it's always wrong. And I've certainly discovered that in my long career as a social scientist. So what we're arguing is that to tackle complex adaptive problems like child disadvantage, what we need is a set of comprehensive methodologies that are data-driven and evidence-based, deeply grounded in the interdisciplinary field of prevention science and related fields such as developmental psychology, criminology, and complexity science. And in talking like this, I particularly want to acknowledge my debt to Professor Tony Vinson, who was a professor at the University of Sydney and New South Wales over his career, and who died last year. It was at the feet of Tony back in the early 1970s. I'm not quite as old as Keith Hancock, but I'm getting there. It was working with Tony in the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research back in the early 70s that I learned that you could apply the scientific method to complex social problems. And Tony introduced me to the fact that there were great concentrations of social problems all at once in a relatively small number of geographical localities. And in fact, a high percentage of people in prison come from a very, very small geographical part of any part of Australia. I'd also like to acknowledge my debt to Professor Jacqueline Goodnow, who died 2 years ago, probably Australia's greatest developmental psychologist of the 20th century, or certainly one of the greatest. Tony introduced me to social action, community work, the use of social science methods to tackle social problems. Jacqueline introduced me to the whole idea of the life course and developmental developmental psychology. So tonight I want to tell you a little bit about the methodology that we at Griffith are developing and implementing and refining in 9 disadvantaged communities in different parts of Australia, and that's a list of some of the organisations we're working with. Do you know, it's almost a full-time job recruiting and working with all of those partners, and some important partners aren't on that list because it's an old list. For example, our multimedia partners from Envision here in Brisbane have become valued partners, not just for the technical development of what we're doing, but also the intellectual development. And there are others as well that I've missed out, like Logan Together, which should be there. They're partners as well. So the interesting thing about these partners, this is kind of the triple helix in a long list. There are people from different kinds of industry in there, including a bank who did a small amount of voluntary work for us, but also Envision, a different kind of industry. There are a whole range of non-government organisations and government departments, as well as, of course, the university and some other research groups. So it's all intertwined together, and this is the way things are going. Universities are getting more proactive about developing these kinds of triple helix collaborations. I couldn't get a good logo or a picture of a triple helix, but essentially the idea, it's the intertwining over time of work by university, business and government. And we need to explore how to do that in a much more full-blooded way in Australia if we're going to tackle these complex problems. So I am going to move straight to the problem, let's just review quickly what we know about disadvantaged communities, what's happening in Australia. Well, let's get back to the core problem. So looking at the most recent ACOS report, Australian Council of Social Service report on poverty, look, that's a long quote. I've highlighted a few sections. Key thing is that the headline rate of poverty in Australia, using a pretty stringent definition, is 13.3%, which is slightly better than it was in 2012. So that's a good news story, I guess. But there's been a 2% increase in child poverty in the last 10 years, and Australia's poverty rate remains above the OECD average. This is not a good thing, I would have thought. And importantly, the poverty rate for children remains significantly higher than for adults at 17.4%. And a lot of that is what economists and social scientists call deep, persistent disadvantage. So these are the families which are under enormous stress and which unfortunately end up producing a lot of the problem statistics that criminologists and other social scientists study. And lone parent families in particular are at particular risk of falling into poverty. Women, particularly on their own, are still in our society very much at risk, and their children. So, the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth has just published a report a week or two back where they're looking at trends in a whole range of areas that affect children, including poverty. But this is a section of indicators that relate to being loved and safe. And I've highlighted a few things there, that 20% of those aged 15 to 19 were extremely or very worried about family conflict. And this is something we hear a lot about when we go out visiting communities, which we've been doing all of this week in Sydney. The number of children in, the number of children in out-of-home care has been on an upward trajectory, and we always read things like this. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are almost 10 times more likely to be in out-of-home care. Finally, detention of children and youth, something of great interest to criminologists, is actually showing some good trends. The proportion of children aged 10 to 17 in detention has been gradually declining, as has the number of youth offenders in Australia. Did you know that? Did you know the youth crime rate's going down? How many people actually knew that? Okay, who didn't know that? There you go. So you've learned at least one thing tonight. Youth crime is going down, as it is everywhere in the Western world, and indeed as other forms of crime are going down. Down, down, down. Hey, that's a good slogan for the next society conference. So when you look at learning outcomes, there are also really major issues. I meant to make a point here. Although the number of kids in detention has been going down, young people in prison aged 18 to 24 has been increasing. And of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people are 25 times more likely to be in detention. So it's all bad in those regards. We trail the OECD in preschool attendance, and we're going backwards. According to the latest figures, we are actually declining in the proportion of 4-year-olds exposed to high-quality preschool education. Did you know that? I didn't either until I read this. But the good news here is that Year 12 retention rates for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people are improving. Okay, I'm not going to bore you with statistics for the whole evening. I just wanted to give you some context. Now, the important thing is that these figures do reflect an underlying reality because things like school violence are very strongly correlated with social inequality and with concentrated disadvantage and with family stress and breakdown. So more than a third of principals in Australian public schools are experiencing physical violence and bullying at work, most of it from students. It puts things in perspective for us university people, Mike. And suspension rates in both Queensland and New South Wales schools are skyrocketing. We see headlines like this periodically. Schools are solving problems of young people by kicking them out, excluding them. And if there's one thing we know from the longitudinal research in criminology, and that is that kicking kids out of school is a risk factor, a big risk factor for getting into trouble later on. It's almost designed to generate crime. Now, we're getting into the really serious stuff. This is a little boy called, 11-year-old boy called Patrick Slater, who on Australia Day in Perth last year killed, well, he was part of a group that killed a 46-year-old man with a screwdriver. And I don't have time to go into detail, but where did this child come from? He was one of the younger children from a large family in Perth. At the time of his arrest, he was not regularly attending school. What did I just say? And it was reported that his upbringing was marred by domestic violence, family conflict, and the family moving between relatives' houses. At the age of 5, he had witnessed one of his brothers being run over while he was crossing the road, and that led to the family falling apart. In fact, it was traumatic to the whole family, and so on and so on. So the interesting thing, well, this is tragic, but this young boy was transferred or detained in the Banksia Hill Detention Centre in Perth. Now, in my opinion, a remarkable study has just been published in the British Medical Journal, British Medical Journal, which looks at fetal alcohol spectrum disorder amongst the 99 detainees at Banksia Hill for whom permission was gained to do the testing. And this was a really, really comprehensive battery of tests. In fact, testing for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, I'm told by Jan Hamill there, takes 19 hours on average. Dr. Doug Shelton on the Gold Coast here and his team are an expert in this. But the important thing about this study, not only did it test for FASD amongst these young people, but also for a range of other neurodevelopmental disorders. And as you can see from that little sentence that I highlighted there, 89% of these young people had at least one domain of severe neurodevelopmental impairment. Now, what this boils down to in the real world, there's a list of, there's some stats, and I just don't have time to go into this, but this is a really important study, because what this tells you is that nearly 100% of the young people in this institution in Western Australia, and it won't be very different anywhere else in Australia, are incapable of succeeding at school and succeeding in life. They've been abused, neglected, they've been the victims and the witnesses of violence throughout their whole life. They've probably done terrible things as a consequence and ended up in detention. Look at the statistics for both the FASD group and the not FASD group under all of those headings of academic achievement, attention, executive function, which is things like the capacity to concentrate, to control your impulses, not to do the first thing that crops up or jumps into your head. Use of receptive and expressive language, so knowing when an adult's actually asking you a problem or asking you a question or that there's a response required. These children don't have the fundamental psychological and social skills. They're so damaged that it's going to take an enormous effort. I don't think it's impossible, but it's going to take a huge effort to get them to back into full community functioning or even part community functioning. So I regard this as a scandal, as a national disaster. This is just another indicator of virtual genocide that's still affecting our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And it's been a very carefully done study. Jan tells me that the 47% FASD diagnosis is conservative, it's an undercount, and that's probably true, but at least they can defend that figure. It's the highest figure found for children in detention anywhere in the world. Okay, what do we do about it? Let's get on to the main point of this lecture before I have to finish. Obviously, there are many, many reasons for these figures, and you can read the article, it's very informative. But here's what we do about the problems. Now, you probably all see, does anyone not know where that photograph came from? Right, it was the Don Dale Youth Detention Centre in the Northern Territory, and what was happening there to those young people led to the Royal Commission and Board of Inquiry into the protection and detention of children in the Northern Territory. And there were a whole range of recommendations from that Royal Commission. For example, the establishment of a network of family support centres to provide place-based services to families across the Northern Territory, a 10-year generational strategy for families and children to address child protection and prevention of harm to children, and a paradigm shift in youth justice to increase diversion and therapeutic approaches. Wouldn't that be a novel idea, given those sorts of figures that are undoubtedly going to be true in the Northern Territory as well? Now, I'm told that because probably of local infrastructure issues, from where I sit, it appears that the report did not fully explore or think through the critical importance of developing an infrastructure for comprehensive evidence-based early prevention strategies for these. We've got to stop this thing happening before it starts. That's the ultimate solution to the Banksia Hill problem and to these other problems of youth in detention. So we need to work toward, I think in Australia, the abolition of youth detention and move toward a Scandinavian model where, well, for example, in Norway, there are 4 young people in detention. 4. That's just a 4-digit 4 out of however many million there are in Norway. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't other young people who got into trouble with the law and who are in secure or semi-secure environments, but those environments aren't detention as such. They're very supportive environments where therapy and their needs can be addressed in a much more full-blooded way. Now, I want to move very quickly. Well, I'm going to skip over this evidence that the criminal justice system doesn't work. This is a study of 29 randomised controls from the United States that compared youth detention or criminal justice processing of young people with community-based alternatives. 29 randomised trials. It's about the best evidence we can get in the social sciences of what works. Well, it turns out, I'm not going to explain this diagram, just take it from me that the conclusion that I've managed to delete, the conclusion is that in almost every case, in almost every study, the criminal justice processing of young people produced a worse outcome than the alternative. In other words, the whole youth justice system, at the very least, is a very expensive and inhumane way of making conditions worse than they were before the young people went in. There has to be a better way. And here is a list of some of the strategies that have been developed over the years, again in the United States mostly, to work out what works in terms of early intervention and prevention. So the idea is you get in early to stop the development of criminal behaviour or drug abuse or antisocial behaviours or dropping out of school, whatever it might be. You get in early before it starts to develop as a problem, or at the very least before it becomes entrenched as a problem. Now, the point I'm trying to make here, I don't have time to go through the individual programs and the strategies that they represent. I just want to make the point that there are literally thousands and thousands of well-tested, proven, effective early intervention and prevention strategies, as well as treatment strategies for young people or adults who are already in trouble. In this country, we hardly invest in these at all in the tertiary system of criminal justice or youth justice. And we really haven't been wholehearted as a country about supporting the early intervention and prevention. But I'm going to spend the rest of this lecture, most of the time anyway, talking about the work we're doing here in our research team at Griffith to strengthen the family and child systems that are currently being delivered throughout Australia. And I'm going to skip, this is my own research with Matt Manning on the effect sizes of on a whole range of outcomes of early intervention and prevention. Look, just take it from me, I'm a professor, believe what I say, this stuff works, and the benefits are not just in stopping crime, but also in educational success. That's what ES is, and cognitive development and social and emotional development and reducing drug abuse and improving social participation, reducing contact with the criminal justice system and improving family well-being. This is win, 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 however many times bars there are up there on the screen. Why don't we do it? I want you to ask your local member why we don't do this more. The Perry Preschool program was the lighthouse early intervention program in the early 1960s in the US. An enriched preschool program where kids have been followed up, a randomised design. kids have been followed up for basically the whole of their lives. And it turns out they were beneficiaries, the intervention group of this enriched program, which I'm not going to describe, just again, believe me, but here are the results. In terms of the multiple arrests, non-preschool participants, 55% were arrested, only 36%, that's still far too many, mind you, but there's a big gap between the preschool group, the non-preschool group and the preschool group. And this is years later. But also in terms of owning their own home and unemployment, this program had a remarkable effect. Now, this has been a lighthouse or an inspiration program, for many, many decades. When I was in London about 10 or 15 years ago and the enormous Sure Start early intervention family support system was being put in place, I asked Naomi Eisenstadt, the director of that program for the UK, who incidentally comes from New York City, what was the genesis of this enormous program? And she said, "Oh, Ross, this is all just peri-preschool." The peri-preschool programs had an enormous influence. And yes, here's some more economics. James Heckman, a Nobel Prize winner in economics, has done the cost-benefit analysis. He's really used very, very thorough methods. I've had a chat with him about it a couple of times. And there's a $12.90 return per dollar invested. Not only do all of these strategies work, but they actually save money. Now, why was it you said we aren't doing this? Don't know. It's a cultural problem, isn't it? We are so wedded to the idea of punishment. So the problem now, okay, we've got all this evidence of what works or what doesn't work, but most of that evidence is still small scale. So the problem that we're working on here at Griffith in the Creating Pathways team is how we actually go from small scale to large scale. And in order to do that, we had to get out there ourselves in a real community and learn a bit about what makes communities work and how to do this work. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the outcomes of this project that several of us worked on for many, many years. So the Pathways to Prevention project, as you can see, acting early before problems emerge or become entrenched. This operated in a disadvantaged community in Brisbane for over 10 years. We were one of the partners. Education Queensland was a partner, but also the actual community services were run by Mission Australia. Now, part of the theory behind Pathways was that we should be strengthening the links between schools, families, and the community services. So we argued that all parts of a child's developmental system must be in harmonious, mutually reinforcing relationship. Doesn't that sound wonderful? I mean, those words just trip off the tongue. What does it mean? It means that parents know what's going on in school, and school knows about the parents, and there's harmony and reinforcement between the family and school. And when families have problems, there are agencies working locally that they can go and get some help from. And they're not afraid to go and see those people. They're not afraid that children are going to be dragged off to the welfare. It's really hard to get that theory actually implemented effectively in practice. But the focus of all interventions, we argue, should be to build such mutually reinforcing system relations. Just as an example, that's an old classroom that was converted for family use. That was an idea of Kate Freiberg. Let's make spaces, safe spaces in these schools where mums could come with their toddlers or young children, mums who mostly didn't have enough courage to come through the school gate because their own experiences of school were so disastrous. These sorts of rooms did become safe and happy places for children and their parents. And it helped to build bridges for a while anyway between families and schools. And we also introduced some preschool programs for these young people, focusing on communication and social skills. No comment there. So social skills, ability to interpret social information, overcome unproductive emotions like anger, and so on and so on. Okay, and we also supported the families. And there's a whole range of the holistic programs which were implemented. So, what was the outcome? Well, one of the things we've done is to track those preschool children from the early days to have a look at which ones ended up with a youth justice record. Now, here's the good news. Out of 353 of those young people for whom we had reliable data, only 6% had a record, which is pretty good, really, given they're coming from an area which I would have predicted where the rate of offending would have been at least double that level, based on official statistics. So that's a really good result, but was that low figure a result of the Pathways intervention? That's the really difficult question to answer. We have some grounds for optimism that, yes, part of the answer was the effect of the work that was done over many years with more than 1,000 families in that area. So it turns out that when we surveyed 58% of all of the preschoolers who were transitioning to high school, and we asked them a whole series of questions, and then we correlated their answers with whether or not they ended up with a youth justice record. So at the end of primary school, the major predictors of serious offending revolved around, this won't surprise you, things like a lack of attachment to school. That was the single biggest or strongest predictor of a subsequent record. And having antisocial friends. Well, no surprises there. In fact, most of the things that are in this list, and I won't read all of them, a criminologist would just shrug and say, yeah, well, that's how it is. Now, the question is, did the Pathways participation actually affect things like attachment to school and impulsivity and having antisocial friends and so on and so on? Well, what we were able to show from our careful analyses of the Pathways kids compared with matched control groups was that Pathways did, in fact, to my amazement, if the family support was sustained over a long period, the kids had better NAPLAN scores. So there you go, that justifies all the money the Department of Education put in, I guess. Although I have to say that was only in grammar and numeracy, but not in writing. Incidentally, you're the first to hear these results. They haven't been published yet, and we've only just completed some of these analyses. Oh, sorry, time to stop. Anyway, I think it's mostly a good news story. But the bad news is that, unfortunately, a disproportionate number of those kids who did end up in trouble are Aboriginal boys. And there's not a lot of evidence that we had a huge effect on those families where the risk factors, the adversity was really strongly concentrated. Now there are very interesting implications of all of those analyses, which we are going to publish as soon as we can, implications for social policy. So the important question here, it's not just about one project. Remember I started a few minutes ago by posing the problem of how we go from science to service, how we go from small scale to large scale. Now, what I've just said about Pathways, the Pathways project, is actually a segue into that, because what we were testing when we looked at the effects of Pathways and family support was the effects of routinely delivered support services that you'll see in communities all around Australia, including in remote communities. So nobody has ever, to our knowledge, anywhere in the world, ever been able to establish medium or long-term effects on children of what I call routinely delivered family support services. These are not specially devised services. We didn't design the services that Mission Australia or the schools implemented. We helped them do them better, perhaps, and we did help with the evaluation. But these are a pretty good cross-section of the sorts of things that you would find in the communities we were visiting earlier this week in Sydney, for example. So all of the, facilitated playgroups and child support programs and community liaison and parent support groups and so on. The good news is that there's a lot of evidence that this actually does have beneficial effects. The bad news if you're a criminologist, is that some of the critical risk factors, like attachment to school, were not very strongly influenced. So you ask kids, you measure them, what actually happened, how they're feeling at the moment, and we had an interactive computer game that did that. The things that come out are having a strong supportive home environment and their own personal, social and emotional confidence. These were boosted by their parents participating in the support program. But unfortunately, some of the things that are even more critical for youth offending, like attachment to school and impulsivity, were not as strongly affected. So it's win and lose. And it's a complex picture. So there's no magic bullet. Now, to finish off, I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes highlighting work we're doing, not unfortunately in all 52 of those communities throughout Australia, but in 9 of them, 3 in Queensland and 6 in New South Wales, as part of a federal government program called Communities for Children. So we're working now within an existing government program to try and strengthen it by introducing prevention science methods. And as that cartoon says, innovation without capacity is of very limited value. So we're building the tools and electronic resources, the videos, the modules and interactive, whatever they're called, Isaiah, that actually empower and support people to deliver services better and to measure the impact of what they are doing. And we call what we're doing building a prevention, translation and support system. So now I'm going to walk over to the computer and hopefully show you just in a minute or two some of the things we're doing.
Let's make a difference. Let's talk about transforming the developmental system. Let's find creative solutions to divisive problems. Let's cultivate conditions for collective action. But first, let's just talk about kids. Every child in our community is on a life path full of possibility. Their journey is one of ups and downs, choices, consequences, chance events, and sometimes issues that are too big for them to overcome alone. It can be a turbulent pathway. That's where we all come in. As schools and community organisations, we travel alongside children and families, each of us bringing our specialised skills to deal with factors like lack of school readiness, unemployment, housing insecurity, family violence, child abuse, and social isolation. We're all motivated, but sometimes it feels like we're not making much difference, especially when we're mired in challenges, like competitive funding structures that pit us against each other, a focus on reactive problem solving at the expense of long-term planning, time and energy lost to red tape, the multiplicity of problems faced by families, and organisational silos resulting in duplication of effort. The fact is, we're working harder than ever, but the evidence shows outcomes aren't improving for many families and children. It doesn't have to be this way. By making smart, small changes, we can bring about big improvements. How? By building a better vehicle, a new framework that allows us to travel this path together. So what should this vehicle look like? Is that it? Or that? Maybe this? Let's start with a blank page and really think about what components we need. First up, we need collaboration. By joining forces to address all angles of a complex problem, there's hope we can achieve real impact. But it's not enough to just come together and share a vision. We all have to ensure the things we do reinforce what others are doing. We need mechanisms to keep our collaborative relationships strong, and clear roles for each partner built on trust. This gets us going, but there's more to consider. To really make a difference, we need to understand how problems start so we can develop early prevention strategies. The ability to make change early in the pathway is critical for success, but that's not all. As we mobilise for collective impact, we need to monitor our performance. Are we moving at a reasonable speed, in the right direction? Does the data suggest we need course corrections? Without accountability, we won't get where we need to go. And there's another key component we need to add. For sustainable change, we have to develop the skills and organisational capacity of local people so the community can power itself. And finally, we can't travel in the dark. We need to look carefully at evidence and make informed decisions about which activities suit our goals best. With the right blueprint, we can create a vehicle to achieve lasting change in the community. Collective initiatives are already achieving positive outcomes all over the world. Imagine what you could do in your community. So bring your ideas, enthusiasm and expertise and join us on the pathway to a better future for our children.
We use that video in communities to explain to people the principles, C-R-E-A-T-E, create, which underpin the model of practice that actually evolved out of the Pathways project. One day, Kate Freiberg, Sarah and I sat around a table and we wrote down on a piece of paper every word, every principle that was important in where we'd failed as well as where we'd succeeded. And we tried to work out how we could summarise all of that. And looking upside down, Kate immediately said, there it is, create. So that's where create came from. So it's both about the science and it's about the relationships. It's about collaboration and it's about evidence-based practice. It's about data-driven decision-making. It's about bringing a scientific backbone to bear on the amazing work that underpaid women do throughout every community in Australia to improve outcomes for children and for families. They're underpaid, undervalued. We ask these teams of community workers to solve some of the toughest problems in our society. We don't provide adequate training. As I said, we don't pay them enough. The least we can do as a research team is to build some resources and some methodologies that are going to help them do their job better. So that's essentially a summary of what we're on about. I'm not going to show some of the other tools, except I just want to highlight, as we finish, 6:23 p.m, the public health cycle that underpins the whole methodology of the CREATE project. If I can now go here and here. Do you like the zoomy bits? There it is on the left. What we call the Create Change Engine. Well, there's an engine, and we have a computer game called Rumble's Quest, where the child's avatar interacts in the game with Rumble, and they have a conversation, and that produces a lot of data that the child about their life, and it tells us a lot of useful information. It's all done ethically, I assure you, and the data are highly secure. But the Create Change Engine is driven by Rumble, the creature, and that's why it's the Create Change Engine, because I liked it. But the important point is it's coming together, deciding together, planning together, doing together, and reviewing together. Again, that sounds simple, it sounds straightforward, but when that is underpinned by a strong, rigorous methodology based on research, and at every point in that cycle, what you do next is informed by data about your community and data about what works. Bingo. You get some amazing results. And I do have some empirical evidence for that amazing result. And I'm going to finish now by going back to the PowerPoints. And I'm going to zip through. There we go. These are population-wide impacts of a very similar model to what we are engaged in through Communities for Children, but it's with a slightly older age group, just young high school students. This data are based on over 100,000 young people throughout Pennsylvania, a very strong data set, where the impact of this set of interventions in communities throughout the whole of Pennsylvania is evaluated. And you can see there's a 33% improvement in academic performance, an 11% reduction in delinquency, 11% reduction in the influence of negative peers, and a 16% improvement in attachment to school. We cannot, in Australia, produce a graph like that. We haven't done the interventions and done the evaluations at a population scale that would allow us to do that. Our goal in our research team is to, with all of our partners, to get to the point where we can produce something that's even better than that. The Americans, anything the Americans do, we can do better, right? And moreover, we're going to save more than $317 million in the process, which is the estimate of the cost benefit of these various programs that were implemented as part of that system approach to population health. So I'm going to skip all of this. This is all part of the next lecture. There's the last slide. And at this point, I will finish. Nothing hard is ever easy. Sort of obvious, but true. And that quote from Lev Vygotsky, a very great but somewhat Marxist Soviet psychologist. There's nothing more practical than a good theory, and there's nothing more theoretically illuminating than good practice. By bringing some science and some expertise and some measurement and some tools to our very hard-working friends in the school and community sectors, we hope to learn an enormous amount from good practice, so that the discipline of criminology that I belong to and the allied social sciences, which are also heavily involved in this enterprise, can become much better. We can have much better theories and much better understanding about what's really going on to shift the dial for our most disadvantaged young people. Thank you. Three minutes. There's plenty. Richard asked me to run the questions myself. So do you want me to answer them as well as pose them? Yes. Well, one of the consequences, so the question was, probably not everybody heard it, if people were more careful about having children and family planning were more effective, there would be more I think you're saying there'd be more families which have the resources to look after their children properly. And it's all planned and, yeah. Okay, well, yes, I mean, obviously that would be a good thing. But one of the results of empirical research and evaluations of these sorts of interventions is that anything that empowers women and improves their educational levels will generally lead to better family planning, because women in particular, become more in control of their lives. So that's one positive thing I can say about the research. But I can say that it doesn't really matter in many cases whether the child was planned or not. The reality is that many of these families are facing barriers and stresses which I wouldn't be able to deal with as an educated, middle-class white professor. When your house burns down and your money's all in New Zealand because the Australian government has a rule that means you don't have any rights as a citizen for the first 2 years of your arrival, and so you're dependent on the local primary school principal to advocate with the bank so that you can actually access your resources, your money. I mean, that's just one random example that came into my head. The barriers and stresses and crises that the families we've been working with face routinely beggar the imagination. It is amazing that they do as well as they do under the circumstances. And now, those economic stresses and social stresses are going to apply, I think, regardless of whether the child was planned or not. So it's an interesting point, but I don't think it's the key point that's underlying these issues. There's one up the back first, Duncan.
Oh, hello. I was just wondering about if you're including neuroscience in some of this stuff, just thinking about what you were mentioning, and particularly the intergenerational nature of stuff, just that, as you were saying, some of those hardships are also genetically passed on from generation to generation. So if that's part of your kind of research and
well, it's
development.
not, thank you for that question. It's not part of our research because the reality is that the human services sector, community services sector and schools aren't equipped or trained to be able to do those sort of neurodevelopmental interventions. Now, certainly some people like Jack Shonkoff from Harvard University are saying we need to now develop the interventions that are based on the insights of that kind of neurodevelopmental research. And there's active research going on in that area. But that's got to translate into usable and user-friendly tools that you can work with children and kids perhaps who are like the Banksia Hill young people with a whole range of developmental disabilities. So I'm optimistic. You're absolutely right what you say about the intergenerational impacts of fetal alcohol and genetic factors. But a lot of that's influenced by the whole history of colonisation of our Indigenous people and epigenetic processes, which are only, and I don't claim to know anything really much about that and what to do about it, except that what I do know is we've got to create safer and more supportive environments for kids where their fundamental developmental needs are met and where the parents' needs are met. And that's what this is all about. When I talk about family support, it's a code for doing that kind of thing and doing it as well as we can. But as I said, the workforce that is asked to do these things, they're not given the equipment to do it, they're not given the training to do it, and they're not paid the money that would be necessary to acknowledge the huge value of what they do. But thanks, that's a really good question. There was one down here at the front. Okay, we'll take the one at the back first and then, oh no, going to come down. Right, sorry. Just down here.
Professor Homel, you mentioned before that one of the critical factors in improving children's development was positive interactions between schools and home situations and things like that. Do you think that sometimes there is an almost mutually exclusive tension there, so that as schools become aware of what is happening in the home, we have a greater importance given to mandatory reporting nowadays, but that actually may decrease parents' and others' willingness to get engaged with the schools because they're worried about the punishment which may result? Do you think that there's a way of alleviating that, or as you mentioned, punishment is so deeply ingrained in our system that the positive is we want to protect children, but the negative is it really about protecting children, or is it a bit about simply watching our back? We reported it, there's nothing more we did. Or about, well, those people deserve punishment rather than deserve the help and, they may well deserve punishment, but deserve the help and benefits so that the families can interact with the school communities and the broader community.
Well, all I could do is applaud what you just said. I totally agree with that. We should get rid of those mandatory... Well, we need to stop punishing parents for problems that their children have, for example, with truancy. It's support that's needed, not punishment. And you're absolutely right that in terms of the general issues of relationships between schools and families, there are enormous gulfs of misunderstanding on both sides.
But even those situations where we know that a parent has done the wrong thing to a child, but now they're starting to get engaged in a school. They're starting to actually be open to the idea of being a better parent, but all of a sudden, because we're now engaged with the school has a requirement
responsibility
to report.
Yeah. So this is...
And all of a sudden, this opportunity, when they are actually open to receiving help, could be crushed by the fact that enforcement agencies will come in.
I agree with you. I am not a particular fan of the whole mandatory reporting or even the blue card system. I don't think these are effective preventative strategies, but that's a controversial point of view. But I never liked the punishment response. There's always a better way.
You're promising saving money, so everyone's for that. You've provided some empirical evidence. So what's preventing this rolling out yesterday? Have you identified particular vested interests, or is it just that it's new?
It's partly that it's new. The evidence base, if you like, has exploded exponentially over the last few decades. It's also that we're really, as the previous speaker said, wedded to the punishment response. We just instinctively think that if kids are getting into trouble, for example, they should be dealt with through the law, and it's understandable why people feel like that. But the fundamental question is valid, and I haven't answered it. Why isn't this happening much faster? Well, it's the political classes, really, that are holding us back here. But there is no strong commitment to doing this. If you look at the Liberal, Labor and Greens platforms, as they are currently on the web, there isn't any talk of this sort of thing. You talk to individual ministers and politicians, they are very supportive in private, but it hasn't translated as yet into major government policy. This whole philosophy of investing early to prevent the problems later on and to save the money later on. I think I'm being ushered off the stage.
I'm pushing you off. There will be opportunities to talk to Ross outside, but I think there are some drinks and food waiting for us outside. So please join me in thanking Ross.
Thank you.
For a really fantastic and obviously engaging talk. So please do take the opportunity to talk to Ross.